Clearly highlighting there is no absolute prevention as an option. With that, I'd like to invite Dr. Jonathan Shaw, Deputy Director, Regional Research Center for Asia Pacific, and the Director of AIT Extension, which stands for Asian Institute of Technology. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Babu, and I'm delighted to have this privilege to be able to address this distinguished gathering on the final day. Of course, several people have gone before me, and many of the main points have been very expertly summarized. There were a few things that stood out for me in terms of how the forum and the role that the forum itself plays in contributing to the development of communities of practice in the adaptation sphere. And I'd like to perhaps just again put on record my reflections on how this forum has gone. I found it a tremendously enjoyable experience. I think the range of participants that are represented here is extraordinary. The depth of expertise, everything about it has been a very enriching experience, and I hope that that's a sentiment that's been shared by many. One of the issues that Louis mentioned in his summary, and I'd like to highlight, is that of communication, because it came up in the context of how we communicate with the private sector. My own sense is that this is less of a problem, perhaps, than some of us are pretending. The private sector is here. And they have contributed to this. But of course we have to get out and go to private sector events ourselves. We've got to visit the companies. We've got to go to the boardrooms, as Louis said. But above all, we've got to talk their language. And Gareth was highlighting that many people that perhaps might be interested in talking to us about adaptation are not interested in hearing about adaptation. They want to hear about the risks to their supply chains. They want to hear about risk management and how we can contribute to that. In terms of communicating risk, of course, there was a fascinating session downstairs just before this plenary on how do you communicate a 1% risk or a 10% risk or a 0.1% risk, and when does it become critical that action follows that communication? In other words, the communication needs to be much more effective than just sending a message out there. So communication seemed to me to be one of the themes that came across very strongly. At the last forum 12 months ago in Bangkok, there were suggestions made that perhaps we could move to more of a tele mode. You know, we've got all this wonderful technology, and it's certainly here in Korea. Why don't we make better use of the technology to bring more people in? There's absolutely no substitute for coming here face to face and talking to people and meeting people. You simply can't get to know people well enough online or over teleconferencing, video conferencing technologies. It's not there yet. It may at some point happen, but I think seeing people in the flesh, shaking their hands, is what's really important. And we found that also when we were talking about the future of APAN and in the steering committee meeting. Yes, we've shared these ideas before, but it's not until you actually come together and you actually thrash it out face to face that you're actually able to make any progress in terms of defining what this APAN is going to be. The focus for me, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I thought that it was absolutely fantastic. I thought that this program was a big improvement on previous events, and I feel that we've really been learning about what needs to go into this forum. But still, there's tremendous variation in terms of how we understand a particular session, and we saw that in a session that I moderated today on neglected and critical groups, specifically with reference to gender and youth. And we saw it again in the communicating risk session, where there were a lot of variation in terms of how the presentations and maybe the expectations of the people that attend the sessions. There's a question of frequency, and we've talked about going to a 2-year conference after this, but is there a need for sub-regional conferences so that perhaps we don't have to travel so far and perhaps we can reach out a lot further? Colleagues from Central Asia have been discussing this with me. How do we organize perhaps 5 annual or biannual sub-regional conferences to supplement the biannual conference that's organized regionally. That seems to be a challenge. I think many people have made tremendous efforts to come here, but we do need a lot more people here. There's been discussion of the particular groups that we reach out to, farmers groups. We did have representatives of Korean farmers here. That's fantastic. But how do we reach out further, and what groups do we actually need to bring into this discussion in order to make it much more worthwhile? And then, of course, back to the question of outcomes and how we measure what we're doing and how we justify it, because at some point we've got to look at the future funding of this conference, and we're completely indebted to those organizations and especially the Korean partners that have come up and supported this event. But longer term, perhaps we can't always depend on the generosity of a particular donor or a particular country. So this becomes a real challenge. But it's less of a challenge if we're able to communicate the outcomes of the conference effectively and show the benefits of this. That's something we have to work on. Again, it's not easy, and I'm sure Salim will agree with me that you're not going to measure it on a month-by-month, year-by-year basis. Finally, I'd just like to say a couple of thank yous. My job is not actually to say the thank yous, but I've mentioned the program already, and I'd like to again thank and congratulate Louis Lebel for the fantastic work that he did on leading the development of the program. It really is, for me, it's a big improvement on previous programs. Thank you, Louis. And most of you have actually met my colleague, Marco Silvestri, who's been the lead organizer on the RRCAP team. Marco doesn't like me highlighting his role, but I think it's inevitable. Everybody's met him, and he really has done an unbelievable job in making sure that you're all here, that everybody's been paid, everybody's basically got what they expect. And I really, maybe the complaints have been going somewhere else, but I'm not aware of any. Thank you, Louis and Marco, for a great job. I'd like to thank also the staff who've been working here, because you've done an unbelievable job. I've seen the level of planning that's gone into this, and that again is a lesson that I've taken away from Korea in terms of the way that you plan events like this and how you mobilize people, the training that goes into the staff. It's been a revelation. Of course, the funding agencies, the other organizations, ADB and the Ministry of Environment Japan, that have supported this, and everybody else. And finally, the participants. It wasn't a vote of thanks, but it turned into one. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Jonathan, for highlighting or re-emphasizing the need to engage the private sector as well as to bring the others group, the farmers as an example, but at the same time to highlight the future challenges also in terms of the outcome. And I think we need to think about that outcome. With that, let me invite Dr. Salimul Haq, particularly the point that the Morrison has mentioned on the loss and damage, and invite Dr. Salim to say a few words and the future thinking.
Thank you, Babu, and good afternoon. I'm an unscheduled speaker at this closing session for two reasons. Firstly, to pick up on what Jonathan just said, the meeting of this nature is invaluable for the face-to-face time with a number of people that opportunity arises in these kinds of meetings. And over the last 3 days, and in fact, particularly over the last 3 evenings, a number of us have been getting together to talk about this issue of loss and damage, which is a fairly new topic that has arisen since the last forum. And in the context of the United Nations Framework Convention, it started off as part of the Cancun Adaptation Framework. But in the last conference of parties that was held a few months ago in Doha, in Qatar, we now have a new decision on this issue of loss and damage, which is for us to carry on some further work on particularly looking at possible mechanisms or institutional mechanisms on loss and damage for the next conference of parties, which will be in December this year in Warsaw in Poland. And given that this region is already moving ahead on adaptation, we felt that this region also might move ahead on the issue of loss and damage. So we have agreed, a number of us, to form an Asia-Pacific Forum on loss and damage. The objectives of the forum are to share information on loss and damage within the region, to support and facilitate further research on different aspects of loss and damage and provide recommendations to relevant institutions, and to support and facilitate convening of meetings, workshops, conferences, training courses on loss and damage. And I've given the contact address of my colleague Erin Roberts there if you want to make a note of it. If you're interested, please send us an email and we'll send you more information on this. I'll just say one more thing about it in the context of what it's going to do. What it will not be is a lobbying or advocacy group. It is an information sharing group. The idea is for us to, those of us who have an interest in this, maybe doing research in it, to share information with each other going forward, and hopefully have something to share with the Conference of Parties, the 19th Conference of Parties. It's going to be held in Warsaw in December this year, who have called for assistance and information on what an institutional mechanism on loss and damage might look like. So I just wanted to announce that in the context of what Jonathan just said. It can be, I think, well claimed to be an outcome of the Incheon Forum. It would not have happened without the forum for us to be coming together and to come up with this forum idea of a loss and damage forum. So I'd like to thank the organizers for allowing us to do that. Before I step down, I would also like, Babu, if you could come out of your hiding place, to also ask you to thank Babu and his team of People APAN as well. And I'd like to take a little bit of credit myself. Babu has learned the ropes working with me for at least 10 or 15 years before he joined UNEP. So I'd like to take some of his credit for having built his capacity to be able to do something like this. So please join me in thanking him and his team. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim, for the last word, but as well as contributing to the challenge that Jonathan has thrown on the outcome. With that, our closing remarks is over, and you may think, okay, this is the end of the day and end of the forum. But I think it's better to hear from the future generation for whom we are collectively working and trying to secure the future generation. With that word, I would like to invite Ms. Song Hyun Lee, the climate change adaptation supporter, to introduce the choir, the future generation that they will perform in a few minutes. Ms. Lee.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you today at the 3rd Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum 2013. My name is Hyun Lee, and I major in environmental health at Korean University. I'm grateful for the chance to speak about an issue that concerns us all, the environment, more specifically, climate change adaptation. Majoring in environmental health, I naturally became in the environment. Since last year, I have been volunteering as a climate change adaptation supporter sponsored by the Korea Environment Institute. I'd like to make sure that everyone here knows what climate change adaptation supporters do. They are concerned volunteers who take great efforts to inform the public about climate change adaptation. Our major activities are making training materials and teaching elementary school students about climate change adaptation. Why elementary school students? You would understand if you ever taught them before. They absorb information quicker than a sponge. What comes to your mind when you think about the children of today? Are they merely young children who need your protection? Though small today, they will grow into great leaders who will shoulder the burden of responsibility inherited from older generations. However, if the focus and energy present at this forum today could be passed along to them, I believe they will further research into climate change, and they will help us all adapt to climate change. Witnessing the children's genuine enthusiasm, was truly inspirational. I have no doubt that they will be ready to face the challenges that await them. I met several supporters whose enthusiasm was equally inspirational. I'd like to share with you some words of wisdom from one of the supporters who left a lasting impression on me. She said that if we can recognize climate change adaptation as a habit, we will make a change. Many of our daily activities are habitual. For example, we wash our hands after using the toilet and brush our teeth after meals. These are just simple activities, but as you know, they're crucial for our health. I think climate change adaptation can work out in a similar manner. So I ask you, where do we get our habits from? The answer is from our education in childhood. Since education is the most effective way to change the future, I'm surely convinced that if the children are well educated about climate change adaptation and practice it as a habit, we will see enormous changes. Unfortunately, however, most people are unfamiliar with this crucial concept. When I taught elementary school students as a supporter, I was really surprised because most of them knew very little about climate change. They had only a vague fear of a melting Earth without much knowledge to understand it. On a positive note, however, this can be easily changed. As a member of the younger generation, I'm saddened and frustrated when confronting the devastating results of reckless developments by previous generations. I do understand that some of these were necessary and we have benefited from them. But at the same time, I am fully aware of the urgency of changing our attitudes or approaches pertaining to climate change. And I remain convinced that exploring realistic solutions like climate change adaptation is a more reasonable approach to creating the change we need. Right now, let us not dispute who is responsible for it. Blaming someone else changes nothing. Finding solutions together changes everything. Lastly, I'd like to say thank you for your time. I appreciate your real and constant efforts regarding climate change adaptation. I promise I will inherit your passion and take great pride in helping to find workable solutions for our green future. Thank you very much. Before I leave, I'd like to introduce you to a special song